On maps pinned to the operations wall, the airfield looked too far from danger to ever become a story of loss. The front line had shifted west weeks earlier, leaving the strip of hardened earth and steel hangars wrapped in a fragile illusion of distance. Transport crews joked about predictable schedules, and ground mechanics spoke more about spare parts than survival. Yet war rarely announces when it redraws its boundaries. In the early morning haze, before engines warmed and signal lamps flickered awake, a quiet question lingered in the airfield's routines, unnoticed by those who believed safety could be measured. Daily life moved with procedural calm. Fuel trucks followed chalked routes across packed soil. Clerks logged cargo manifests with mechanical precision. Pilots arriving from interior bases treated the airfield as a waypoint rather than a battlefield. The surrounding farmland showed winter scars of little active damage, and nearby villages resumed muted market routines. The runway's length and repair facilities made it vital for sustaining distant armor formations, yet that importance felt abstract to most personnel. The absence of sirens for months had reshaped instincts. Helmets rested loosely on heads, and sentries watched horizons more from duty than expectation their eyes. Command briefings reinforced this perception through statistics, showing enemy air activity concentrated far beyond current fuel range estimates. Reconnaissance flights reported minimal hostile interception along supply corridors, and analysts trusted established models built from previous campaign patterns. Weather forecasts predicted heavy cloud layers that historically discouraged deep strike attempts. Over time, these assessments hardened into institutional confidence. Maps displayed threat circles that stopped well short of the airfield. Junior officers absorbed these visuals as reality itself. Questions about long-range experimental missions or modified fuel carriage rarely progressed beyond speculation, filed away as possibilities too inefficient for an enemy already stretched. Ground crews focus on tangible problems: worn tires, oil viscosity in cold temperatures, and a constant balancing of spare engine parts between squadrons. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with coal smoke from heating stoves placed along hangar walls. Mechanics developed routines of touch and sound, identifying mechanical flaws before instruments confirmed them. Their world felt contained within metal panels and toolkits. News from forward units arrived as delayed reports stripped of emotional immediacy. Casualty figures existed as numbers, not faces. In this environment, psychological distance from the war's brutality grew quietly, forming a protective layer that few realized. Air traffic controllers developed personal familiarity with regular transport crews, recognizing engine tones before radio confirmation. The predictability created subtle pride, as if efficiency itself signaled mastery over chaos. Mess halls served hot meals without blackout interruptions, and laughter occasionally replaced guarded conversation. Letters from home were read under stable electric lighting rather than emergency lanterns. For many stationed here, this was the closest experience to normal life since deployment. That normality shaped risk perception. When occasional distant artillery rumbled at night, it felt like weather, something acknowledged but emotionally dismissed, reinforcing the idea that the war's center of gravity. Despite the calm, small anomalies accumulated. A reconnaissance unit reported unusual radio silence patterns far beyond expected patrol routes. Another flight crew noted faint contrails at altitudes inconsistent with friendly aircraft performance. These reports entered logs but rarely reached strategic urgency. The airfield command staff balanced countless data fragments daily, and most anomalies resolved into harmless explanations. War created noise as much as information. Patterns only emerged when someone chose to connect them, and no single officer felt compelled to redraw the operational picture. Confidence in existing models created intellectual inertia, slowing the recognition that enemy doctrine could evolve faster. Geography also reinforced complacency. The airfield sat within a shallow basin surrounded by low ridgelines and river bends that complicated low-altitude approach paths. Historical analysis suggested any attacking force would be detected long before reaching strike distance. Radar installations, though limited, had consistently detected training flights and weather disturbances. This reliability bred trust. Local anti-aircraft units drilled regularly but without urgency, practicing against simulated targets to maintain certification. Ammunition stocks remained high, but firing experience remained limited. Defensive strength existed on paper and in storage crates, yet lacked the sharpened instinct born only from repeated combat engagement exposure experience. Seasonal weather further shaped expectations. Winter cloud cover often masked long-distance navigation and increased mechanical failure risk for aircraft attempting extended missions. Meteorological officers emphasized these factors in daily briefings, reinforcing the belief that nature itself formed an additional defensive barrier. Frost-coated wings during pre-flight inspections, and engine startups required extended warming cycles. These conditions made local crews feel that any hostile pilot would face overwhelming technical challenges before reaching the basin. Over time, environmental hardship became psychologically reinterpreted as strategic protection. Even though history repeatedly showed determined forces could adapt technology and training to overcome climate obstacles consistently, the command hierarchy rewarded stability. Officers who maintained smooth supply throughput earned commendations, while those raising unverified threats risked being labeled inefficient or alarmist. This cultural pressure, subtly guided, which reports gained attention. Staff meetings emphasized measurable output, tonnage delivered, sorties completed, maintenance turnaround times. Intangible warnings carried less institutional weight. Over months, this environment trained leaders to prioritize continuity over speculation. The airfield became a machine optimized for predictability. Yet war historically punished static thinking. The possibility that an enemy might accept heavy losses to achieve deep disruption remained theoretically acknowledged, but emotionally discounted during daily planning cycles routine. By late winter, the airfield existed within a carefully constructed narrative of control. Every successful landing reinforced belief in systemic reliability. Every quiet night confirmed assumptions about distance and protection. The human mind, exhausted by prolonged conflict, sought stability wherever it appeared. For the men and women stationed here, safety had become less a condition and more a shared story repeated through routine and reinforced by statistics. Yet the structure supporting that story relied on incomplete data and unchallenged assumptions. Beneath the surface of efficiency, vulnerability waited quietly, shaped by confidence, waiting for the moment when reality would demand recognition. Winter reconnaissance reports arrived in thin folders, their paper edges curled from cockpit humidity and freezing air. Inside them, navigators described faint radar echoes appearing beyond established patrol grids, usually dismissed as atmospheric distortion or civilian transmissions. Intelligence officers cataloged these anomalies with procedural discipline, assigning reference numbers and filing them into trend charts that rarely altered strategic maps. The air war had settled into predictable corridors for months, and command staffs across the theater trusted the mathematics of fuel range and payload weight. Yet scattered across these documents were small suggestions of adaptation, slightly longer flight durations, unusual radio silent intervals, and occasional sightings of high-altitude aircraft maintaining headings inconsistent with standard reconnaissance doctrine. None of these reports alone justified alarm. Together, they formed an incomplete picture, like fragment of photograph not yet assembled. Officers trained to prioritize confirmed threats saw statistical noise rather than coordinated evolution. Meanwhile, the enemy's research divisions worked quietly, experimenting with auxiliary fuel systems, engine tuning methods, and navigation procedures designed to stretch operational reach beyond historical limits, without immediately triggering pattern recognition. Among analysts, these shifts seemed theoretical rather than operational, reinforcing confidence in existing defensive calculations and established planning assumptions. Within planning conferences, senior officers balanced hundreds of variables, from shipping tonnage schedules to replacement pilot training rates. The airfield's role within the broader logistics network reinforced confidence that any hostile attempt to reach this region would require unsustainable fuel sacrifices. Doctrine emphasized efficiency, and enemy planners were assumed to value aircraft preservation over symbolic disruption. This assumption shaped risk models used across the command structure. Weather data further strengthened this belief. Seasonal jet stream patterns and persistent cloud ceilings historically complicated celestial navigation and long-distance visual formation flying. Meteorological briefings highlighted icing risk at higher altitudes, suggesting any extended mission would push engines and crews to dangerous limits. As these factors accumulated, The theoretical possibility of deep penetration strikes transformed into an operational improbability. Younger intelligence analysts occasionally question whether technological adaptation could offset these obstacles, but institutional memory favored precedent. Past campaigns have followed predictable escalation paths, and deviations were historically short-lived. The human desire for pattern stability merged with professional experience, creating an intellectual environment where innovation by the enemy was acknowledged academically, but rarely integrated into daily defensive posture planning or resource allocation decisions across theater commands during routine strategic review cycles annually conducted. Beyond conference rooms, signals intelligence teams monitored radio spectrums for deviations from established transmission rhythms. They detected occasional bursts of encoded traffic originating from air bases previously associated only with training operations. Linguistic analysts noted changes in call sign rotation frequency and shortened communication windows, patterns sometimes associated with units preparing for operational deployment. These observations entered weekly intelligence digests but competed with higher priority battlefield developments. Ground war offensives and naval convoy threats demanded immediate attention, pushing ambiguous air signals into secondary analysis queues. Field commanders relied on summarized intelligence rather than raw intercept data, and summaries often smoothed irregularities into general trend statements. Meanwhile, test pilots and engineering crews on the opposing side refined procedures for extended-range navigation, experimenting with fuel mixture adjustments and weight distribution changes. Each technical success slightly expanded operational flexibility. Individually, these improvements appeared marginal. Collectively, they allowed planners to imagine missions once considered unrealistic. The distance between theoretical capability and operational execution narrowed quietly, hidden beneath layers of bureaucratic filtering and human attention limits inherent in large wartime command structures. Managing multiple simultaneous theaters of combat responsibility across vast geographic regions under centralized strategic oversight and logistical coordination systems globally linked during war. At the airfield itself, routine masked subtle shifts in readiness posture. Maintenance officers requested slightly higher fuel reserves, citing cold weather consumption uncertainty. Requests approved without deeper strategic discussion. Training schedules added occasional extended duration navigation exercises, framed as skill maintenance rather than threat response. Pilots welcomed the additional flight hours, focusing on instrument reliability and endurance management rather than potential interception scenarios. Local radar crews recalibrated equipment more frequently after detecting minor signal anomalies during night rotations, though technical reports attributed most irregularities to atmospheric refraction. Supply officers continue prioritizing cargo throughput metrics, measuring success through efficiency charts displayed in operations offices. Daily life proceeded with disciplined order. Mechanics replaced hydraulic seals, radio operators logged routine position reports, and cooks prepared meals timed to sortie schedules. The airfield's rhythm felt permanent. Yet behind routine efficiency, uncertainty existed in small personal reflections. Some personnel reread intelligence bulletins more carefully, noticing language shifts describing enemy experimentation. Others wrote letters home expressing cautious optimism, sensing change without being able to define it. Institutional confidence remained intact, but individual intuition occasionally registered unease shaped by experience rather than formal briefing guidance provided during scheduled command information sessions across all operational departments' weekly cycles. Strategic blindness rarely emerges from ignorance alone. It grows from systems that reward stability and penalize disruption without proof. Within theater headquarters, planning staff faced overwhelming information flow, forcing prioritization based on perceived probability and immediate battlefield impact. Deep strike scenarios remain categorized as low likelihood, receiving limited simulation resources. Budget allocations favored proven defensive measures rather than speculative countermeasures. Over time, this resource distribution shaped training, equipment maintenance, and alert procedures. The enemy benefited from this predictability, studying response times and defensive radar coverage through long-range observation flights. Data collected over months allowed them to identify optimal approach corridors and timing windows. For personnel at the airfield, life continued inside a carefully maintained operational narrative emphasizing efficiency and reliability. Yet historical precedent suggested warfare punished static assumptions. The gap between perceived security and actual vulnerability widened slowly, measured not in dramatic failures, but in incremental misinterpretations. By the time institutional awareness typically shifts, conditions have already evolved. In this period, the airfield existed within that silent transition, performing flawlessly according to outdated threat models while the broader strategic environment adjusted around it without immediate visible confrontation from opposing forces, adapting doctrine technology and operational planning methodologies continuously under wartime. Morning operations began with the familiar vibration of transport engines, a low mechanical hum that usually signaled another predictable supply cycle. Ground crews moved with practiced coordination, guiding aircraft toward unloading zones marked by faded paint and tire grooves pressed into winter-hardened soil. Radio towers exchanged routine position confirmations, their voices steady and almost casual. Then a single inbound transmission carried hesitation, a pause between words that made the controller lean closer to his headset. The returning aircraft requested priority landing, citing mechanical irregularities, yet its flight schedule showed no prior combat zone exposure. Observers on perimeter watched the silhouette descend, noticing uneven wing alignment and a thin smoke trail dissipating into the cold air. The landing approach remained controlled, but small corrections suggested control resistance. When wheels touched runway, the aircraft bounced once, settling heavier than expected. Emergency crews rolled forward, engines idling loudly in the winter stillness. The smell of overheated oil reached technicians before the cargo ramp fully opened. Something about the aircraft condition felt wrong in ways checklists did not describe, a quiet contradiction between official reports and physical evidence sitting heavily on the runway surface, radiating warmth through cooling metal panels under gray. Inside the cockpit, the pilot remained conscious but disoriented, his oxygen mask hanging loose against his collar. Medics helped him down the ladder, noting tremors in his hands inconsistent with simple fatigue. His flight log showed fuel consumption far exceeding planned route requirements. Navigation charts spread across the briefing table confirmed the anomaly. The aircraft should have retained significant reserve capacity, even accounting for weather deviations. Instead, gauges indicated near depletion. Maintenance crews opened access panels, discovering puncture patterns along the fuselage underside, clustered in a formation consistent with high-velocity defensive fire. Yet no friendly units operated anti-aircraft systems within the aircraft's documented corridor. Officers exchanged measured glances, resisting immediate speculation. Technical analysis required methodical confirmation. Still, each new observation deepened unease. The aircraft's radio equipment showed interference scoring, suggesting signal jamming or proximity to active electronic countermeasures. Weather records revealed no storm severe enough to force radical route changes. The possibility forming quietly inside the operations room was simple. The aircraft had encountered hostile forces in territory assumed safe. No one spoke the conclusion aloud, but it influenced every calculation made afterward, shaping questions directed toward the recovering pilot and driving technicians to recheck every component twice before. Debriefing the pilot required patience. His speech slowed by exhaustion and lingering oxygen deprivation. He described contrails appearing above cloud-covered altitudes he initially believed unreachable by enemy fighters. He reported brief radio static followed by visual flashes that suggested coordinated attack runs. His memory fractured under stress, but repeated one detail. The attackers disengaged rapidly, climbing instead of pursuing extended combat. Intelligence officers noted this tactic aligned with fuel preservation strategies, allowing deeper penetration without sacrificing return capability. Mechanics cross-referenced bullet impacts with known munitions characteristics, narrowing potential enemy aircraft types. None of the identified models matched previously confirmed operational ranges. The realization spread gradually through technical teams and command staff. Charts once used to demonstrate safety now appeared incomplete. Personnel moved through routines with heightened attention. Radar operators reviewed store recordings, searching for faint signals previously dismissed. Signal specialists requested expanded monitoring bandwidths. Supply officers quietly calculated evacuation contingencies for high-value equipment. Emotional responses remain contained, expressed through efficiency rather than panic. The airfield still functioned smoothly, yet awareness of exposure settled into daily thought. War felt closer, measured not in distance but in capability, forcing personnel to reconsider assumptions about reach and intent during. Maintenance teams worked through afternoon light, documenting damage with cameras and measurement tools. Each hole in the aircraft's skin represented velocity and angle, allowing trajectory reconstruction. Analysis suggested the aircraft had been engaged from below and behind. Classic interception positioning requiring precise timing and radar guidance that implied coordinated ground support or airborne control assets operating deeper into contested zones than previously assessed. Anti-aircraft units near the airfield received updated alert instructions, rotating crews into extended watch cycles. Ammunition crates were moved closer to firing positions. Training drills shifted tone, replacing procedural repetition with scenario rehearsals based on new threat projections. Mess hall conversations grew quieter, dominated by speculation grounded in technical facts. Some personnel felt frustration at intelligence delays. Others felt professional focus sharpen. Letters home written that evening carried careful language, describing routine without revealing concern. The winter sun set early, casting long shadows across aircraft parked wing to wing. Ground frost returned, forming thin crystals over metal surfaces. Mechanics checked tie-downs twice, a gesture of habit and reassurance. The airfield prepared for night operations with renewed attention to radar calibration and communication discipline, aware that detection time might determine survival if future penetrations occurred under darkness. Command staff compiled preliminary reports summarizing findings for higher headquarters. Language remained measured, emphasizing data rather than speculation. The central conclusion acknowledged possibility of extended enemy operational reach. Recommendations included expanded reconnaissance coverage and review of fuel range assumptions used in threat modeling. Senior officers understood institutional response would require confirmation from multiple sources. Yet internal posture began shifting immediately. Alert levels adjusted slightly, enough to justify additional patrol flights without signaling theater-wide alarm. Logistics planners evaluated alternate supply routing options in case future air traffic disruptions increased. The airfield community processed the event collectively, discussing technical details rather than emotional impact. War returned to personal awareness not through explosions or loss, but through understanding that distance alone could no longer guarantee safety. Night duty shifts passed with heightened vigilance. Searchlight crews practiced faster acquisition procedures. Radio operators maintained stricter logging discipline. Sleep came harder for some, shaped by images of contrails where none should exist. The airfield remained operational, efficient, and functional, yet perception had changed. Confidence now shared space with calculation, and routine carried new weight shaped by evidence that enemy capability extended beyond established expectations, requiring adaptation at every level of planning and daily operational thought. Snowmelt mixed with oil stains along the taxiways as morning operations began under a low, heavy sky. The airfield functioned with renewed caution after the damaged transport incident, yet routine still demanded movement. Fuel trucks advanced in slow columns. Mechanics removed engine covers with deliberate care. Radar crews monitored scopes with heightened attention, though hours of static returns and weather distortion had already begun to dull the sharp edge of alertness. War required sustained focus, but human concentration naturally cycled between vigilance and routine. The basin surrounding the airfield held a quiet stillness broken only by engine warm-up sequences and a distant echo of river water moving beneath winter ice. Personnel moved through checklists with precision shaped by recent warnings, yet without visible threat. Tension softened into background awareness. The sky carried layered cloud formations typical for the season, thick enough to obscure high-altitude movement, but thin enough to allow filtered sunlight across the runway. Meteorological officers described conditions as operationally neutral. No one described them as dangerous. For most personnel on the ground, the morning felt like continuation rather than escalation. Another shift performed under careful but manageable risk, reinforcing belief that preparation alone could contain whatever uncertainty remained present inside daily operational cycles. Shortly before midday, radar operators noticed faint returns appearing intermittently at extreme detection range, flickering at altitudes near the upper threshold of reliable tracking. Initial interpretation leaned toward atmospheric scatter, a known limitation in layered winter cloud systems. Still, one technician marked the anomalies for continued observation. Minutes passed with no confirmation. Then multiple returns appeared simultaneously, their formation too symmetrical for natural interference. Alert signals moved quietly through internal communication lines. Anti-aircraft crews moved to readiness positions without sirens, following updated silent alert doctrine designed to preserve response timing. On the runway, ground personnel continued unloading cargo aircraft unaware of the developing situation. Radio controllers attempted identification challenges. No response came. The returns accelerated, descending in coordinated vectors consistent with attack positioning. At that moment, uncertainty ended. Air raid alarms activated across the airfield, their mechanical wail cutting through engine noise and conversation. Personnel reacted through training rather than thought. Fuel lines disconnected. Cargo pallets abandoned mid-transfer. Pilots sprinted toward dispersal shelters. The sky above the cloud layer remained visually empty, yet radar showed closing contact at speed beyond previously recorded enemy penetration patterns, compressing reaction timelines dramatically and forcing command staff into immediate defensive engagement posture decisions. The first visual contact appeared as dark silhouettes breaking through cloud cover at steep descent angles. Sunlight reflected briefly off wings before aircraft leveled into attack runs. Anti-aircraft guns opened fire, concussion waves rolling across the airfield as shells climbed into descending formation. Enemy aircraft separated into precise pairs, each selecting pre-planned targets. Explosions erupted along fuel storage edges as the first ordnance struck. Shock waves shattered windows across maintenance hangars. Ground crews threw themselves behind equipment and sandbag walls. The air filled with the metallic scream of dive engines and the rhythmic thunder of defensive guns. One attacking aircraft released munitions directly across parked transport lines, igniting fuel vapors into expanding fireballs. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition storage near loading zones detonated. Defensive gunners adjusted firing lead angles rapidly, learning enemy approach patterns within seconds. One attacker erupted into flame under concentrated fire, spiraling into farmland beyond the perimeter. Yet others continued attack sequences with disciplined precision. The speed of coordination suggested weeks of reconnaissance and rehearsed targeting simulations. For personnel on the ground, the realization formed instantly. This was not opportunistic strike. It was planned penetration, exploiting known defensive blind spots identified through sustained observation and strategic patience from opposing command structures months earlier. Medical teams established triage points near reinforced storage bunkers as casualties arrived carried by fellow personnel. Some injuries came from shrapnel, others from concussive blast force throwing bodies across concrete surfaces. Fire suppression crews fought burning fuel lines using foam units rarely deployed in real combat conditions. Heat waves distorted air above the runway, mixing with smoke to create visibility challenges. Communication lines overloaded with simultaneous emergency transmissions. Command officers shifted to backup radio frequencies, directing anti-aircraft coordination through simplified call structures. Additional attacking aircraft executed strafing passes targeting radar installations and communications towers, temporarily degrading detection capability. Despite damage, defensive response adapted quickly. Surviving radar operators switched to manual tracking estimation. Spotters relayed visual bearings using prearranged grid references. Coordination improved as shock gave way procedural focus. Several attackers withdrew under increasing defensive accuracy. Others attempted secondary strike runs, but faced denser anti-aircraft fire. The engagement lasted minutes, though personnel later remembered it as extended duration. When final enemy aircraft climbed back into cloud cover, the airfield existed inside a transformed landscape of burning structures, cratered taxiways, and scattered debris from destroyed equipment and damaged aircraft across operational zones. Silence returned gradually, broken by secondary fires and distant vehicle engines responding to damage zones. Personnel emerged from cover, some moving automatically toward assigned emergency roles, others pausing in stunned observation of destruction that hours earlier would have seemed impossible. The smell of burned fuel mixed with insulation smoke and scorched metal. Snow patches melted into dark water pools around impact craters. Command staff began immediate damage assessment, mapping strike accuracy against known infrastructure locations. The pattern revealed precise targeting knowledge. Fuel storage, radar systems, communications relays, and aircraft concentrations had all been selected with strategic intent. Survivors processed emotional shock quietly, focusing on tasks that preserved operational continuity. Losses were acknowledged through lists rather than ceremony. The airfield remained functional but wounded. Emergency engineering teams began runway patch repairs before smoke fully cleared. Nightfall preparations included reinforcing defensive positions and redistributing surviving equipment. Personnel moved with controlled urgency shaped by understanding that strategic assumptions about safety had collapsed permanently. War was no longer distant. It existed directly overhead, measured not in theoretical reach, but in physical damage now embedded across the airfield's terrain, reshaping daily reality for everyone stationed there from that moment forward. Smoke lingered across the airfield long after the final fires were reduced to controlled burn zones. The landscape no longer resembled the orderly grid of runways and service roads that had defined daily life for months. Craters filled with gray water and melted frost reflected twisted metal fragments and broken antenna towers. Emergency crews moved with slower, more deliberate motion now that immediate survival tasks had passed. The sound of combat had faded, replaced by generators powering temporary communication stations and the distant scraping of bulldozers clearing debris from taxiways. Medical evacuation vehicles departed in steady intervals, each carrying personnel whose lives had changed permanently in minutes of concentrated violence. For those who remained, the airfield felt unfamiliar despite every landmark still technically existing. Familiar hangars now held burned scars. Supply warehouses stood partially collapsed, their contents scattered across mud and snowmelt. War had rewritten the geography of the place. Yet operational necessity demanded continuity. Aircraft still needed to land. Supplies still needed distribution. The first phase of recovery began not through ceremony, but through measurement, cataloging, and repair. Engineers marked structural weaknesses with chalk lines. Signals crews laid temporary cables across open ground. Each task carried emotional weight, but execution remained precise, shaped by discipline learned through long exposure to wartime loss. Command staff convened inside a reinforced bunker, whose walls still smelled of dust shaken loose by concussive blasts. Intelligence officers presented compiled strike data, using hand-drawn overlays showing attack vectors, bomb impact grouping, and estimated approach corridors. The patterns left little ambiguity. The enemy had studied the airfield for weeks, perhaps months, identified offensive radar gaps created by terrain shadowing and equipment maintenance cycles. Intercepted communications suggested coordination between long-range reconnaissance units and strike formations operating beyond previously accepted range envelopes. The briefing shifted from tactical summary to strategic realization. Established threat modeling had relied too heavily on historical performance limits rather than potential technological or procedural evolution. The difference between what enemy aircraft had done in previous campaigns and what they had demonstrated here represented not incremental improvement, but doctrinal shift. Staff officers debated resource allocation changes. More fuel would be required for extended defensive patrols. Additional radar installations would need relocation onto elevated ground regardless of construction difficulty. Training programs would need to emphasize adaptive response rather than fixed scenario repetition. The discussion remained calm, professional, and analytical, yet underlying every recommendation was acknowledgement that confidence had allowed vulnerability to grow unnoticed across months of seemingly stable operations. Across the airfield, survivors processed the event through work. Mechanics inspected aircraft that had survived the strike, running hands along fuselage panels as if verifying reality through touch. Some discovered minor shrapnel damage that would have gone unnoticed days earlier, but now triggered immediate repair priority. Pilots reviewed defensive maneuver protocols with renewed seriousness, studying interception patterns reconstructed from witness accounts and radar fragments. Mess hall conversations carried quieter tones, focused on practical lessons rather than speculation. Grief existed but rarely appeared openly. Names of the lost were spoken carefully, usually during equipment checks or paperwork reviews, moments when emotional control could remain intact. The psychological shift extended beyond fear. Many personnel experienced sharpened clarity about the war's scale. Distance no longer provided emotional protection. The conflict had reached into their workspace with deliberate precision. This realization created a shared seriousness that replaced earlier routine comfort. Personal routines changed subtly. Letters home became more direct, describing conditions honestly without unnecessary reassurance. Sleep schedules adjusted as personnel volunteered for additional duty rotations. The airfield community redefined itself around resilience rather than presumed safety, shaping individual behavior in ways that would influence long-term operational culture across every department and command function. Reconstruction progressed with urgency balanced against strategic reconsideration. Engineers redesigned fuel storage placement, dispersing reserves across multiple reinforced locations to prevent single-strike ignition chains. Communications infrastructure shifted toward redundant, buried cable systems less vulnerable to aerial fragmentation. Anti-aircraft batteries received repositioning orders based on newly calculated approach angles derived from strike analysis. Supply routing procedures diversified, reducing reliance on single corridor delivery patterns. These changes required significant labor and resource reallocation, yet command approved them without delay. The strike had provided proof of concept that theoretical vulnerabilities could become operational disasters if ignored. Training doctrine shifted toward dynamic threat modeling, encouraging junior officers to question assumptions supported only by precedent. Intelligence collection expanded focus toward technological experimentation within enemy development facilities rather than solely tracking deployed units. Meteorological analysis incorporated new variables, recognizing that weather once considered protective could be exploited through instrument navigation improvements. Every modification reflected broader transformation in defensive philosophy. Security would no longer depend on distance alone. It would depend on constant reevaluation of enemy capability, acknowledging that war's technological and tactical evolution often move faster than institutional comfort with change. Higher headquarters circulated revised strategic guidance across multiple theaters using lessons drawn from the strike. Airfields previously categorized as secondary risk zones received upgraded defensive priority. Reconnaissance coverage extended deeper into contested territory, focusing on infrastructure supporting long-range aviation capability. Training manuals incorporated case study analysis, describing how gradual pattern changes could signal major doctrinal shifts. The event entered official records not as isolated surprise, but as indicator of broader transformation in air warfare thinking. Historians and planners later studied the strike as an example of how institutional confidence, when combined with incomplete intelligence interpretation, could create systemic vulnerability. For personnel who lived through it, the historical meaning mattered less than daily adaptation. Yet over time, awareness grew that their experience had influenced broader defensive restructuring across multiple commands. The airfield eventually returned to operational efficiency, though it never regained its earlier sense of isolation from frontline danger. New personnel arriving months later learned about the strike through training briefings, treating it as established history. Those present remembered it as transition point between two understandings of war, one shaped by distance and probability, the other shaped by demonstrated capability. In that transition, doctrine changed, and survival calculations became permanently more complex across every level of air war planning thereafter.